This is the story of a king who took Versailles, turned it into his palace of pleasure, and brought the monarchy to the brink of collapse.
Que voulez-vous?
Louis XV, que Dieu nous a donné pour roi.
The waking ceremony of the Duke of Anjou, by grace of God, King Louis XV, monarch of France and Navarre. And just an 11-year-old boy.
N'est-ce pas une bien lourde tâche à laquelle je suis appelé?
Souvenez-vous, votre bisaïeul vous a prédit que vous serez le plus grand roi du monde.
Qu'advient-il de celui qui faillit, monseigneur?
Suivez en tout l'exemple du grand roi, Louis XIV. Et vous aurez la même gloire.
Louis will reign for 58 years, but his whole life will be lived in the shadow of another man's glory, his predecessor, Louis XIV.
Louis XIV was an incredibly tough act to follow. He is seen as the great. He's the conqueror of Europe. He adds to France. He's the greatest monarch of the 17th century.
He was the first actor on the stage of Versailles. He was the sun, he was Apollo, the sun god. Everything orbited around him. The etiquette of the court, the day of the court, the extraordinary life lived entirely in the public gaze.
In his patronage of the arts, in his building projects, in his personal conduct, in the way he dressed, the way he ate, the way he looked, the way he walked. From the fountains in his gardens to the silver by his bed, he had established a form of etiquette with the sole view of making the whole country of France entirely focused upon his person and his power.
Louis XV never expected to be king, but both his father and grandfather died before they could reach the throne.
Louis XV loses his parents and his grandparents when he's 2 years old. He's an orphan brought up by people that he doesn't know very well, some of whom are probably fairly terrifying as courtiers. He's a sickly child very early on.
Wherever he went, Louis was surrounded by the legacy of his great-grandfather, the man who first built the extraordinary palace that was his home.
Certainly, one would imagine Louis XV has been traumatized by the death of all his near family and is a lonely and probably slightly disturbed child in his youth. And I think this carries through the rest of his life.
Louis had been called the King of France since he was 5, but others ran the country in his name. On his 12th birthday, it was time for him to take his crown and his place on the world stage.
The coronation of Louis XV was a moment of great hope and expectation for the French people. They had had long years of war, and now the country was at peace, and it had a young king in whom it was possible to invest every conceivable hope. So they could project their ambitions and expectations for the new reign on this young, as yet untested king.
But there was a shadow over Louis's inheritance, cast not by an eclipse, but by a mountain of debt. Despite all his success in war and diplomacy, Louis XIV never managed to balance the books, or even pay for the building of his enormous palace.
On a craint pendant longtemps que la nuit qui nous entoure reste là à jamais. Mais dans quelques 2 minutes, sire, vous allez voir le soleil réapparaître. Et ce sera comme si rien ne s'était passé.
Louis XIV, when he died, left France in absolutely dire straits. After a long war, he of course left France something like 20 years' revenue in debt, 2 billion livres in debt at least. And this was going to be an absolutely massive problem.
2 billion livres. That's 160 billion pounds in today's money. But before he could start work on that problem, there was one other thing that demanded the new king's immediate attention: marriage.
Louis XV was more than ready to get married. When he was 15, his original fiancée, who was the little Infanta of Spain, was still only 5 years old. And since 15-year-old boys loathe sweet little girls, he was rather embarrassed to have her around the place. Also, the ministers were terribly keen to get him breeding, so the little Infanta and her dolls were packed off back to Madrid, and a new wife had to be found. They cast about for princesses, and they eventually settled on Maria Lesinskaya, who wasn't the most obvious choice, since her father was the deposed King of Poland, and she really had no money. She was 22, quite pretty, although, as the female courtiers disparagingly remarked, her complexion had never known any other cosmetic than snow. Nonetheless, 15-year-old boys aren't really very choosy, and Louis fell madly in love with her at once.
La reine plaît infiniment à Sa Majesté. Notre roi l'a honorée 7 fois.
Royal sex lives were public property, and Louis was much discussed in the corridors of Versailles, if not always believed.
7 sacrements pour la première nuit, je n'en crois rien du tout. D'ailleurs, les rois trompent toujours leur peuple.
Vous voyez, une ingénue peut parfois tromper son monde.
Le roi!
Louis was now a husband, but he had yet to truly become a ruler. So he set out to copy his great-grandfather. Louis XIV had begun his reign by becoming his own prime minister. So now, number 15 decided to do exactly the same.
It would have been very simple for Louis XV to choose a prime minister, which would have been a much better solution for him, because he could have then had someone picked and appointed for the job.
Il est temps que je prenne moi-même le gouvernement de mon État et que je me donne tout entier à l'amour que je dois à mes peuples. Aussi, ai-je jugé nécessaire de supprimer et d'éteindre les fonctions de Premier ministre. Je veux suivre en tout l'exemple de Feu le Roi, mon bisaïeul.
He's got this sense of he has to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, and to be a real king, he has to be a new Louis XIV.
Louis was living just like his great-grandfather, ruling as an absolute monarch, enjoying the hunting in the forests around Versailles, and soon fulfilling the first and most important of all his royal roles, fathering an heir.
Mon fils! Un fils. Mon fils, mon roi.
La Vierge que j'ai priée à Notre-Dame et à Sainte-Geneviève.
The relationship between Louis XV and his wife, Maria Leszczyńska, started very well, really.
Un dauphin.
They managed to put together a relationship which, over a period of 10 years, certainly, was quite a happy one. They had a string of children, and they seemed to have found a certain, emotional support in each other's company.
Maître Corbeau sur un arbre perché.
More children followed at regular intervals over the next 10 happy years. 8 girls and 2 boys.
Mes petites amours, mes petites torches, faites un baiser à votre père, là, sur la joue.
Louis may have enjoyed being a father, but the Queen, after a decade of non-stop pregnancies, was fed up with it all.
The Queen began to complain that she was either pregnant in bed or being brought to bed. Eventually, they had 10 children by the time Louis himself was 27. The Queen had really had enough, so she began to tell the king that he wasn't allowed to come into her bedroom on certain saints' days because she was a very pious woman. Gradually, the saints' days got more frequent and the saints themselves became increasingly obscure, until finally Louis lost his temper and asked Lebel, who was the concierge of Versailles, to bring him a woman, any woman.
Louis only had to ask, and just about anything and anyone could be provided, and was.
The king gradually got into the habit of first having dalliances with the court ladies and then full-blown affairs.
Vous savez que j'ai une sœur, Louis?
Louis began a life of carnal adventures that would turn him into one of history's greatest libertines.
He was a great womanizer, but there was nothing unusual about that. French kings were expected to be womanizers. This was seen as a sign that they were virile and were going to produce an heir and were in fact acting in an aristocratic and masculine way. Indeed, within the aristocratic society that the king had been raised, the idea of marital fidelity was seen as laughable.
Louis's first illicit amour was Louise Julie de Nesle, a beautiful young aristocrat and the eldest of 5 equally attractive sisters.
Eh bien, ma sœur m'assaille de lettres depuis quelques mois, et elle ne rêve que d'une chose, me dit-elle, être ici, à Versailles, qu'elle appelle son Eldorado.
What was interesting was that he then proceeded to take all the other sisters in her family as his mistresses too. And although it's slightly doubtful that he had an affair with the 4th, it's probable that he did.
Et qu'elle aimerait se coucher. Elle est juste à côté.
Eh bien, faites-la entrer.
Ma sœur?
Il ne faudrait pas que proche du roi, elle n'y gagne qu'un vilain refroidissement.
It was rumoured that one of the sisters, the Duchesse de Châteauroux, would ask her other sister to come along and give matters a helping hand occasionally.
Viens, ne prends pas froid.
In some senses, it was a scandal, but I think people thought it was funny rather than disgraceful. Both Louis XIV and Louis XV had huge sexual appetites, and perhaps 4 women were really what the Bourbon blood needed.
Louis's affairs with his favourite sisters and his simultaneous flings with many other women produced the inevitable consequences.
In the course of his reign, the king would father a whole brood of illegitimate children. We're not actually sure how many, but certainly in the region of 30, I think, would be a decent guess.
But as the rooms of Versailles filled up with Louis's offspring, the king's mind moved to affairs of state. He'd decided to copy his illustrious predecessor in another way, by taking France to war.
The decision of Louis XV to go to war in 1744 was hugely popular. This is what a king of France should do. He should be seen at the head of his armies, fighting and leading his troops.
Louis's declaration of war against France's traditional enemies of Britain and Austria made him a hero on the streets. And so did his decision to lead his armies in person, accompanied, of course, by 2 of the de Nesle sisters. But war was to bring Louis his first brush with death.
While he was at Metz, he fell terribly ill, and it was considered that he was going to die.
Certainly the doctors had given up hope, and back in France, the population was shocked, genuinely, absolutely frozen with fear that they would lose their king.
L'état de Sa Majesté a empiré. Tout est perdu.
In order, as a Catholic, to receive the last sacraments, he had to confess. And in order to confess, he had to send away his mistress and renounce her.
Louis didn't think much of his marriage vows, but like most people of his age, he did believe in heaven and hell. And he knew which one he wanted to avoid.
La Sainte Église ne peut donner les sacrements à votre Majesté. Dès lors, que sa maîtresse est à ses côtés.
The king, like the least of his subjects, was afraid of dying without absolution and was afraid for the state of his immortal soul.
Sauvez mon âme, mon Seigneur.
He knew that one day he would have to face God and give an account of himself, and then he would just be a man before God, like any other man.
Il vous faut quitter cette ville immédiatement, madame, et n'y plus jamais paraître.
N'y a-t-il plus aucun espoir?
C'est le prix du salut de mon âme.
The mistresses were sent away, but they refused to go completely. They hung around in the town of Metz until the bishops were obliged to send a message saying that our Lord wasn't really going to wait upon their pleasure, and would they please get out.
And so the Donnell sisters was dispatched. The king promised that if he was saved, he would dedicate the rest of his life to the well-being of religion and his subjects.
Avec le secours de votre sainte grâce, je vous demande pardon pour mes fautes.
The king received the last rites, but then, miraculously, recovered. And it's from this period that his name, Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, dates, because the people were so pleased that their young king had recovered from his illness.
Sa Majesté me charge de vous dire qu'elle se repent du mal qu'elle a pu commettre et promet de consacrer le reste de ses heures au bien de ses sujets.
But Louis's newfound piety didn't last long.
As soon as he possibly could, he went back to his old ways.
And within a few months, Madame de Châteauroux was back in his bed.
Louis the Beloved became even more popular in 1745. He was present on the battlefield as the French army crushed the Austrians and the British at the Battle of Fontenoy. France was the dominant power in Europe once again, just as she had been in the time of Louis XIV. It was the perfect moment for Louis to meet the love of his life.
He's out hunting in the forest outside Versailles, and he comes across in her carriage this very beautiful, very striking young woman. Everyone knows he's taken by her. People refer to her as Louis XV's latest piece of game.
She was called Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, the future Marquise de Pompadour, and she was much more than a piece of game.
In fact, Madame de Pompadour is a rather well-connected woman with one of the key factions at the heart of power, who form part of a big financial clique. What everyone says, she's strikingly beautiful. And her beauty is really the key to her initial success. She uses her beauty, she uses her very considerable political acumen to establish herself at the heart of the king's power.
Monsieur le Duc, les vieux raisonnements moraux sur l'infériorité féminine, la tendresse de son tempérament et sa faiblesse intime sont à oublier. Selon messieurs Diderot et d'Alembert, la femme est l'égale de l'homme.
Vous écoutant, madame, il me serait difficile de ne pas en convenir. De grâce.
She was nicknamed Renette, the little queen, as a child, because when she was 8, she had gone to see a fortune teller who had told her that the King of France would fall in love with her. So she and her family were absolutely convinced that this was her destiny.
Demandez à un crapaud ce qu'est la beauté. Il vous répondra avec mon ami Voltaire.
She sang, she danced, she had a beautiful voice, she was very well read, marvelous conversationist, extremely charming woman.
Très spirituelle. Très spirituelle.
Que l'on serve encore à notre chère marquise de ce vin du diable qui délie si bien les langues. Si.
Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour were really very much in love. And at first, in fact for some years, their relationship was sexually passionate. He found her very desirable. Not so much, I think, because she was as sexy as the de Nesle sisters had been, but because she understood him very well. She knew how to amuse him, to captivate him, to charm him, to divert him.
La pudeur, Louis.
Ève était nue jusqu'à l'invention de la honte.
Soit. Mais fermez les yeux.
Certainement pas.
She was a very emotionally intelligent woman, Madame de Pompadour, and I think it was this that Louis loved in her. Unfortunately, she herself said that she was physically a cold woman. She didn't really derive any pleasure from lovemaking. She didn't have the temperament for it. But she tried very hard. She put herself on all these sorts of ridiculous diets of, egg yolks and red wine with gold flakes sprinkled it to try and build herself up and increase the heat of her temperament in order to satisfy Louis in bed. But her maid, Madame d'Orsay, pointed out that she would kill herself rather than please Louis by doing this, and so she gave it up.
Tiens, voici l'abbé, le confesseur des jolies femmes.
Madame Pompadour may have been a favourite with her lover, the king, but most other inhabitants of Versailles were not impressed with her.
On dit qu'un certain roi a 500 bouffons qui l'accompagnent partout pour le faire rire.
The courtiers loathed Madame de Pompadour because she was bourgeoise. They could not forgive her for being middle class. It was just about acceptable for a king to have liaisons with lower class prostitutes, but a maîtresse en titre had always been an aristocratic woman.
Ignoring the snobs at court, Pompadour used all her charm and intelligence to advance the interest of her small group of friends and do down her rivals.
She was associated with a cabal at court who were constantly trying to promote the interests of such and such a general. So she had a kind of a political baggage that she carried.
Elle se fait acheter des châteaux, partout aussi. Projette d'en acheter d'autres encore et vous allez me dire que c'est aussi...
Children are rarely keen on their father's new girlfriend, and the same was true at Versailles, especially when Louis's many children saw him spending a fortune on her.
Qui lui a tiré la langue, c'est bien vous.
Je hais Madame de Pompadour autant que vous.
They felt, rightly or wrongly, that her presence somehow demeaned their father.
Elle déshonore le roi, je le lui ai assez dit.
As a consequence, of course, they famously dubbed her
Madame Putain.
Mummy Whore.
Louis's children may have loathed her, but their mother, the Queen, was rather impressed.
She was particularly nice to the Queen, which poor old Maria Lesinskaya was very grateful for, because until Madame de Pompadour arrived, nobody had ever taken any notice of her at all. In fact, the first time she was ever sent flowers was at Madame de Pompadour's instigation. And although obviously the difference in their positions meant that they could never be anything like friends, the Queen was heard to say, if there must be a mistress, better that it is this one.
Louis was victorious in war and lucky in love, and it made him grow overconfident. In a grand personal gesture, he agreed to a peace deal with Austria, one that handed back most of the territory his generals had just won for him. His ministers thought it was a terrible idea and told him so.
Ça va coûter cher. Ils ont payé sans rechigner les impôts que la guerre imposait. Ne croyez-vous pas qu'il serait juste de leur donner une explication?
Des explications? Des explications. Le roi doit-il s'expliquer?
The peace is not a very good peace for France because France gets absolutely nothing for it except enormous debts from its participation in the war.
The French public, having dispensed millions of livres and lost countless men dead, could not understand why their king was giving up his conquests. As a result, school children and fishwives were said to be running around in Paris with the line, "You're as stupid as the peace."
Just as Louis's popularity began to wane, his love affair with Madame Pompadour was also drawing to a close. His solution was a private harem in the town of Versailles, known as the Deer Park.
When Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour ceased to have a sexual relationship, Louis XV didn't really want to replace her with another mistress. They got on too well for that. And from now on, his sexual appetite was catered for by a series of young women who were brought out from Paris, teenage nymphets, uneducated. Often they had no idea who their powerful lover was.
Young, virginal, beautiful girls are brought in for his sexual gratification. But this is developed into something altogether more salacious by the press at this time.
When things had been going well, Louis was forgiven, even praised, for indulging his royal lust. But after his hated peace treaty, people saw their king's behavior very differently.
There's a sort of gutter press, effectively, which just amplifies this, makes him an absolute sexual debauchee of the worst imaginable kind.
The Deer Park obviously did create rumours at the time. It was, according to them, the scene of these terrible orgies in which underage girls would be shipped in droves from Paris for wicked Louis XV to enjoy. And one of the worst things that was said was that Madame de Pompadour acted as a sort of procuress, that she would find the girls for Louis and entice them to the Deer Park. It couldn't have been less true. Madame de Pompadour knew about it and she accepted it as a necessity.
Et vous, madame? Qu'en pensez-vous?
Faced with a deluge of criticism, Louis turned to the one person he could trust completely.
Pas de grand coucher ce soir. Je n'en peux plus.
Il le faut bien pourtant.
Ironically, the influence of Madame de Pompadour actually increases as she stops sharing the king's bed. She grew more important to him because she was his friend. She was one of the few people, almost the only person, that he could actually trust at court. You have to remember that the court is a place of intrigue and masks and pretense, and nobody tells the truth to the king. So he really needed her. He needed her in his life as his friend.
As the top power broker in Versailles, Pompadour was drawn more and more into the business of government.
Madame de Pompadour's excursion into politics is not something that would make a feminist proud. She was a clever woman, but she really didn't understand politics.
Pour la Lorraine, n'ayez pas d'inquiétude. Dès que le père de notre reine sera décédé, elle sera définitivement...
Louis very foolishly entrusted her as a go-between with the Austrian ambassador. And Madame de Pompadour was so proud of herself, being given this important role. She took it terribly seriously, was very excited, and she was completely manipulated by the ambassador.
Et pour ce qui fut l'objet de notre dernier entretien...
J'y travaille, mon cher ami. Et je travaille le roi en ce sens.
Louis's peace with Austria was unpopular, but his decision to allow Madame Pompadour to secure an actual alliance with the old enemy was downright detested.
Madame de Pompadour certainly is in favour of an alliance with Austria. So it's an absolute shock to courtiers, many of whom have long-term loyalties and no doubt family connections, to find that France is now allied with a traditional enemy.
Criticism of Louis and Pompadour became even more lurid, and it reached every corner of Versailles.
They would accuse her of sexual diseases. They would accuse her of procuring young girls for the king. They would say anything they wanted. There were secret pamphlets, secret poems, extremely rude poems about her physique and her body. Poems would be left in Versailles by court officials, perhaps even members of his family.
J'annonce à votre majesté de la part de Dieu qu'il faut absolument renvoyer Madame de Pompadour au plus tôt. Autrement, sa main vengeresse va s'étendre sur votre royaume et punir vos sujets de la faiblesse de leur souverain.
Some of the secret notes even threatened the king with death.
One of the most famous of these contained the phrase, "Wake up, or stir yourselves, the sons of Ravaillac," which was a direct reference to the man who had assassinated Henry IV in 1610. And so for the first time we start to see references in these pamphlets to calls for the killing of the king.
Que dit-on de moi?
On dit du roi qu'il est endormi dans la volupté, que le nombre de ses maîtresses lui dissimule la vue de ses peuples, que vos courtisans sont corrompus et que vos ministres sont méchants et imbéciles.
Il y a pire encore. Quand je vois vos tristes figures, je le sais.
Il se colporte que le roi a la peste. Et que pour s'en guérir, il prend des bains de sang d'enfant qu'il fait enlever.
In 1750, there's the extraordinary episode where there is a rumour and there are riots that Louis XV is having his police force kidnap children so that he can cure himself of some horrible illness by bathing in the blood of these kidnapped Parisian children. So this is a very serious and very shocking state of affairs.
Les choses comme elles sont dureront bien autant que moi. Réveillez-vous, man de Ravaillac.
Louis's one-man diplomacy was supposed to bring peace to Europe, but instead, in 1756, he joined his new ally, Austria, in a war against Britain and Prussia. It started well, but messengers were soon arriving at Versailles with bad news from the front.
As the tide of war changed against the French, the Parisian public actually got into the habit of dancing in the streets to celebrate their defeats, and by doing so, showing how much they detested that Austrian alliance.
The war was not going well for Louis or for France, and public frustration with the king took a dangerous turn.
In January 1757, Louis XV is going to his carriage, going down the steps, and a certain individual called Damien rushes up. And then he feels blood, and he says, "I've been hit, that's the man that did it."
Monsieur le Dauphin! Qu'on arrête cet homme. Mais qu'on ne lui fasse aucun mal.
Damien is immediately arrested, tortured on his feet by the Chancellor, although Louis XV did not want him to be tortured, to see whether he had any accomplices and whether the knife was in fact a poisoned knife, which is the great fear that they have at the time.
Mais si j'avais voulu le tuer, j'en étais le maître! J'ai voulu que l'avertir. Ma lame n'était pas empoisonnée.
As far as we can see, he seems to be a nobody. He's a Lee Harvey Oswald figure, if you like. But what makes people suspicious is that he's a nobody connected to some quite important somebodies. He's worked as a servant for a number of members of the Paris Parliament. People never quite are certain whether he is not part of a sort of wave of hostility towards Louis XV.
Louis took this amateurish attempt on his life very badly. Although his doctors promised a full recovery, he was convinced this was the end of him.
Je vous laisse un royaume bien troublé. Je vous souhaite que vous le gouverniez mieux que moi.
It's a flesh wound, the mildest of cuts, effectively, but it has a disproportionate effect on Louis XV. He goes into a very deep depression after this because he feels that, you know, he has become, instead of the well-beloved, he's become the well-hated.
Je meurs.
Vos médecins, Louis, disent qu'il n'y a point à s'inquiéter.
Je meurs et je le sais bien. Que l'on fasse venir l'abbé Rochecourt pour qu'il me donne l'absolution.
Vous en connaissez le prix, Louis.
Je vais paraître au tribunal de Dieu, madame.
Rather amusingly, an old marshal comes along and asks him to cough, spit and piss, and he says, "Well, you're okay. Okay, my lad. There's nothing important being touched." But that's not, of course, the way Louis XV sees it.
Alors, la blessure est peu profonde, tout juste la pointe d'un ongle. Bien, très bien.
Elle est plus que vous croyez, car elle va jusqu'au cœur.
The psychological shock of one of his own subjects attacking him. This situation is the culmination of his lack of virtue, and so he's bound to feel that it's his own fault, he's bound to feel guilty, and it's bound to give rise to a great deal of self-questioning.
Hearing the grim details of the punishment planned for his would-be assassin did nothing to improve Louis's mood.
Mené et conduit dans le dit tombeau à la place de grève, et sur un échafaud qui sera dressé, de nailler aux mamelles, bras, cuisses et gras de jambes.
He's going to pay for this very, very dearly, in that he's not merely going to be executed, he's going to be put to death in the most horrible way that can be devised by judicial cruelty.
Sa main droite tenant en micelle le couteau dont il a commis le dit parricide, brûlé de feu de soufre.
He's executed in the most extraordinarily gory way on the Place de Grève in Paris, sort of strapped down to the wheel, and the executioner goes around breaking most bones in his body with an iron bar.
He is burnt with tongs, and his flesh is knowingly pulled away from his body.
And it goes on and on and on. But at the end of it, 4 horses are attached to each of his limbs, and they're encouraged to sort of, gallop off in different directions, pulling his body to pieces. Well, they do that, and it's not working, so the executioner goes back and he starts hacking at various pieces, so effectively he can be pulled to pieces. Damien stays alive and conscious for much of this operation.
He finally dies after 4 hours of absolute torment, which is going to disgust people by its reports.
Assez! Taisez-vous.
Louis had had nothing to do with the grisly execution, but accounts of it stained his reputation right across Europe.
It gives the reign of Louis XV this incredibly ghastly, sort of backward sort of feeling to it.
Although his physical suffering was nothing compared to that meted out to Damien, Louis's mental stability was badly shaken by the affair. His closest aides described him as troubled and depressed.
For a monarch who takes being a king extremely seriously, this is a big thing. And all the court talk about over the next couple of years is this depression, this sort of melancholic vein to Louis XV.
Seigneur, je crie vers vous du fond de l'abîme, que mes cris parviennent jusqu'à vous.
To make matters worse, the conflict with Britain was proving to be disastrous. By the end of what's called the 7 Years' War, the French were driven out of Canada, India, and much of the Caribbean.
The British, largely because of their navy, were able completely to turn the tables on France. France has really lost all her pretensions to becoming a global superpower, and she's lost that to England, basically.
If the world is speaking English today, it is partly because of the outcome of the 7 Years' War in the 18th century. It was a disaster for France, it was a disaster for the French monarchy.
For a king whose greatest hope was to live up to the glory of his predecessor, this was almost too much to bear.
Vous connaissez mon amour et mon respect, mais ne me sera-t-il jamais permis de rien faire sans qu'on vous rappelle à moi?
The main thing that a king of France was supposed to do, which is sometimes forgotten, le métier du roi, was the conduct of foreign policy. Now, he wasn't really supposed to mess around with things like the parliament, internal politics. That wasn't his job, it was foreign policy. And if you can't even get that right, you're going to be hated.
Badly shaken by the assassination attempt and widely blamed for each fresh military disaster, Louis hid himself away at Versailles.
The 7 Years' War was undoubtedly the nadir for Louis XV. He withdrew into himself, and instead of doing what he'd done during the Austrian War, of getting to the front and leading his troops, instead he spent his time hunting. And if he wasn't hunting, he was with the girls in the deer park.
Louis,
Louis may have lost a war, but he was still the absolute ruler of France. And when the criticism of him became too much to bear, he came up with a suitably absolutist response. Even the first encyclopedia in the French language, one of the great intellectual achievements of the age, went onto the bonfire.
Unfortunately, Louis XV was by nature suspicious of anything that he saw as unorthodox, and as a consequence, he just didn't associate himself with this great outpouring of French culture and knowledge.
Louis was still close to Madame Pompadour, who tried to change his mind.
At a dinner party one evening in Versailles, a duke said, "What is gunpowder made of?" And Madame de Pompadour seized the moment and said, "It's true, we don't know what gunpowder is. What a pity it is that your Majesty in his wisdom, you've banned the encyclopedia. Otherwise we could have looked in the encyclopedia and found out what gunpowder is constituted from." So they sent for a copy of the banned encyclopedia, which of course the king had in his private library, and they spent the rest of the evening reading articles in the encyclopedia, and he was of course very intrigued by this, and this was supposed to be one of the reasons why he had it reinstated.
Getting Louis to rescind the ban on the encyclopedia was to be one of Madame Pompadour's last contributions to his life. In 1764, she contracted tuberculosis.
Ce n'est rien, Louis. J'ai consulté vos médecins. Il n'y a rien qui doit vous alarmer.
She shifted out of Versailles, and courtiers record that, I think, as he's seeing the carriage taking her out of Versailles, he weeps a tear. So he is upset, undoubtedly, by it.
He stood on the balcony and he cried because he had lost the person he trusted the most in the world, and he felt very alone without her.
Her death in 1764 is followed by the death of his son, the Dauphin, in 1765, and a couple of years later, in 1768, the death of his queen, Marie Leczinska. So this is the removal of some very important people in his life. The deaths of these people who are close to him in the mid-1760s undoubtedly has a very big impact on him emotionally.
The death of his closest confidant began the worst period of Louis's life. He spent days lost in introspection or deep in discussion with philosophers and astronomers.
Croyez-vous que quelque part au-delà de cette voûte étoilée dont la vue nous enchante, puisse se trouver le séjour des êtres qui nous ont été chers?
Le paradis, voulez-vous dire, si?
Le paradis céleste, oui.
Je ne peux vous répondre qu'en savant, sire.
Parlez sans censure, monsieur.
You can see that he did have a clear tendency towards some sort of depression. For the rest of his life, he remains withdrawn, somewhat depressive, and obsessed with death.
Lorsqu'il plaira à Dieu de vous rappeler à lui, sire, ce sera pour vous ouvrir les portes de son paradis.
Le paradis. Comme il nous plaît d'espérer le paradis.
Just as his courtiers were almost giving up hope for Louis, he recovered his lust for life. The reason was a new mistress, nearly 40 years younger than him.
I'm rather fond of Madame du Barry. She was as beautiful as an angel and as stupid as a basket, but she made Louis very happy. She was utterly, utterly gorgeous. I mean, all the king's mistresses were always described as ravishing, but I think she was the one who truly was. She was fabulously sexy. She was, I suppose, the sort of 18th century version of the tart with a heart.
Prenez garde à l'assassine, Louis.
Madame du Barry had an instant effect on the aging king. He could think of nothing else but her. She was extremely beautiful. She was supposed to look like a kind of debauched angel.
La friponne est pour vous, sire.
Not too bright, but very good fun.
Mais saurez-vous trouver la caressante?
Madame du Barry sort of gives him a bit of a perk up, really.
Madame du Barry has an enormous effect upon Louis XV. He's a man of 60 at this point, and she has been a kept woman. I wouldn't necessarily say she's been a prostitute, but she certainly learned a thing or two in the long periods that she spent with a certain number of particular individuals.
Badine.
And I think Louis XV is delighted with the various tricks that she's learned to keep him young, and so it is very good for his mental health, we might say.
Madame du Barry may have perked up the aging Louis, but that did not make her, or him, any more popular.
She was absolutely loathed. Everyone hated her. The Parisians hated her because she wasn't an aristocrat. The aristocrats hated her because she was really little better than a streetwalker. But the king adored her, and he made her very happy.
Louis XV went far too far, and he was seen really as slumming it. It was beneath the dignity of a king to have these sorts of liaisons.
There is no doubt that Louis XV was somebody who was seen as becoming increasingly dissolute, even degenerate, and who was just failing to live up to the standards expected of a man who was king.
Whatever people said about him, the new relationship gave Louis the confidence to embark on a grand project. To give his new heir, the future Louis XVI, the greatest wedding of the century. The young Louis was due to marry Marie Antoinette of Austria, and Louis wanted the ceremony to take place in a brand new theatre inside Versailles, a project abandoned years before by Louis XIV.
Par le moyen des 60 criques se trouvant sous ce plancher, sire, celui-ci sera remonté à même hauteur que la scène.
Votre table de 22 couverts, sire, à laquelle prendra place la famille royale, sera sur la scène. Elle sera démontée dès la fin du souper pour laisser place à l'orchestre.
Louis XV felt the crown was under threat from the Parlement, from different sections of society. It had suffered the defeats of the 7 Years' War. Therefore, he wanted a spectacular royal wedding to assert the splendor and power of the monarchy.
Comme vous pouvez le voir, sire, l'avancée de votre loge au-dessus de la salle a été supprimée.
Et c'est fort bien comme cela.
The politicians grumbled about the crippling cost of the royal wedding, but Louis just kept on spending.
Cela durera tant que vous n'aurez pas fait taire les parlements, sire. Aujourd'hui, ils parlent de liberté, mais s'ils venaient à devenir les maîtres, ils exerceraient sur les esprits, les discours, les mœurs, l'inquisition la plus violente.
Parliament becomes an endless thorn in the side of the crown. Sometimes the king is conciliatory towards them, at other times he's very repressive against them. But in 1770, he decides to tackle the problem in a different way. He basically tries to abolish the Parlement.
Louis's decision to remove the one organization in France that could challenge him for authority was a flagrant abuse of royal power.
De funestes exemples montrent hélas qu'un royaume, quelque ancien et important qu'il soit, peut sombrer dès lors que l'anarchie s'y est substituée au pouvoir royal. C'est pourquoi nous sommes résolus de briser les parlements et de reprendre la maîtrise des affaires de l'État.
Sire.
Silence!
So this is a coup d'etat in the sense that one of the things that is absolutely key for the self-image of the French monarchy is that it is a legitimate absolute monarchy that rules according to the laws. So to abolish the law courts themselves is a very powerful signal and a very blatant act of royal despotism.
Si notre autorité est sans cesse contestée, si chacune de nos décisions est remise en cause, alors tout progrès est impossible.
Louis believed he was acting in the best interests of France, whose outdated legal system stood in the way of progress.
Il est intolérable que la défense des privilèges de quelques-uns s'oppose à des réformes nécessaires au pays tout entier.
So he introduced wholesale reforms, for example, free justice. Also, the judges themselves were now to be appointed by the Crown for life, and they would no longer buy their position as judge, as had been the case before. So for many, including Voltaire, this was seen as an enlightened reform. Unfortunately for Louis XV, by silencing the Parlement, the king unleashed opposition on a scale that had not been seen for generations.
It was too late for Louis to play the reformer. Years of erotic self-indulgence, along with failed wars and bungled diplomacy, had cemented his subjects' opinion of him. A bad king and a bad man.
Louis XV, towards the end of his reign, is sunk in vice, and the people of Paris and the courtiers are all very well aware that he has somehow taken the path of personal pleasure and not been a very successful king. His reforms are falling flat. He's got a mistress who is frankly not of courtly rank, and he's simply not kingly. On top of it all, on Easter Sunday, 1774, the Abbé Beauvais, the most eloquent sermonizer at the court of Louis XV, makes this devastating sermon.
Tels ces vieillards vicieux qui conservent encore dans les glaces de l'âge les feux impurs de la concupiscence, finit par chercher de nouveaux plaisirs dans les vils restes de la licence publique.
This is really scandalous. It is such a direct attack on the morality of the king that's never been witnessed at court.
Sire, mon devoir de ministre d'un Dieu de vérité m'ordonne de vous dire que vos peuples sont malheureux, que vous en êtes la cause, et qu'on vous le laisse ignorer.
Louis XV himself must be intensely mortified by the fact that he is not loved, that he faces opposition at court, and for the fact that he is so isolated within his own courtly environment.
If the Abbé intended to wound Louis, he could not have expected what happened next.
Weeks after this humiliating dressing down by the Abbé Beauvais at Easter, Louis XV falls ill. Nobody knows what's wrong with him. And it takes the doctors gathered around him several days to work out what's going on. They bleed him, which can only weaken him, to my mind. And then suddenly one of the doctors sees familiar blotches and they realize that he has smallpox.
It is a complete bolt out of the blue. Smallpox in the 18th century is still an absolute killer disease.
De la lumière, qu'on approche de la lumière.
He had a particularly unpleasant form of it, which was the black variety that changed the entire colour of the face to a sort of dark copper mask.
Elle en aura fait des ravages.
And so he was completely disfigured.
Even as he approached death, Louis's enemies spread stories about his sex life.
It was suggested that he may have caught his smallpox from a prostitute, but the whole idea of a corrupt body, of a corrupt king, was very resonant. And it was thought that this was a fitting punishment, the outward and visible sign of an inward, invisible damnation.
It riddles his body and it produces a horrible stench as his inner organs start decaying.
On dit que la tête de Sa Majesté est aussi noire que celle des habitants de la lointaine Afrique.
Noir comme le fond de son âme. Pour son âme, soyez assurés que Sa Majesté en demandera l'absolution avant qu'il soit trop tard.
Noir comme son cœur, alors.
Underneath it all, he is very devout, and he goes into ultra-devout mode. He sends away Madame du Barry from the court in the same way that he sent away the Duchesse de Châteauroux in 1744 at Metz.
Sa Majesté ne veut pas recommencer le scandale de Metz.
Once she had left, it was possible for him to receive the last rites of the church. And in his final hours, he made a great effort, I think, to die as a Christian.
Messieurs, le roi m'a chargé de vous dire qu'il demandait pardon à Dieu de l'avoir offensé et du scandale qu'il a donné à son peuple. Que si Dieu lui rend la santé, il s'occupera de faire pénitence, du soutien et du soulagement de ses peuples.
J'aurais aimé avoir la force de le dire moi-même.
In fact, he did face it the last few days with considerable courage.
He goes about dying like a good Christian, like a good king. Dying, in fact, like Louis XIV.
When the announcement came, no one seemed to care.
Le roi est mort!
When he actually dies, you can hear a stampede, almost the thunder of running feet as everybody abandons the antechamber where he's lying.
The death of every king, you have to have an autopsy, and the king's physician offers this to the ceremonial officers, and they don't want to know at all. They turn their back and run rather fast, clutching their noses as they do so, and the king is sealed into an iron coffin.
Once the news of his death was known, there was great celebration. There was a general sense of relief that the man who had once been Louis the Well-Beloved had gone. The population had just lost any hope or confidence in their king, and indeed I think it's fair to say they'd fallen out of love with their king.
It has been argued that the monarchy could never recover from the harm engendered by Louis XV. He had dragged it into such disrepute that there was no recovery.
The abiding memory of Louis XV is a man who is morally corrupt and is unable to rise above his melancholy to any kind of grandeur. He is the least grand of the French monarchs, surely.